Hi there and welcome to our webinar. My name's Craig Willis. I'm a Customer Success Director from SCORE. SCORE is a web-based process discovery, insights and improvement platform. I'm joined here today with Daniel Lawrence from Lawrence and Wedlock, and we're going to be talking about how to get started with RPA. Hi Daniel, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about Lawrence and Wedlock and why you chose to work with SCORE.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. So Lawrence and Wedlock are one of the co-founders of the company. Myself and Christian started the company a number of years ago. Started off in business transformation, and more recently with RPA, robotic process automation, which is one of the things we're going to look at in this webinar. And we help companies to automate their back and front office processes using a number of intelligent process automation products. And more recently, we partnered up with SCORE because we wanted to digitize the initial part of the RPA process, which is the discovery and definition.
Thank you, Daniel. This is part one of a series of webinars where we're going to be exploring robotic process automation, how to make the most of it in your organization, how to get started, how to scale, and then other sorts of challenges that you might find along the way. Before we get started, it's important to understand a little bit more about what robotic process automation actually is. So, Daniel, I wonder if you could tell us.
Yes, Craig, it's probably a good idea to start back at the beginning and what RPA is. We as practitioners forget now, with having used the product for a number of years and the marketing machine and the media about RPA running so wildly, you think everyone knows what it is now, but that's not always the case. And I always start a statement like that typically with what RPA actually isn't, because it's often more important to clarify the misconceptions as well as addressing what it really is. So RPA stands for Robotic Process Automation. It's a term that was coined about 10 years or so ago. So I guess the most important thing, first of all, there are no actual shiny metal robots sitting in a room somewhere. It's basically automation software. It's used mostly or deployed mostly at the user interface surface level, working with systems and computer screens. It uses code and scripts to execute automated tasks. It certainly isn't a silver bullet, despite what you might have heard in the media. It can't and won't solve any problem. It's very deterministic in its approach. So it's really just a tool, and from our experience, we've found that it's really only as good as the person using it in a lot of respects. But some of the older sort of IT experienced folks would sort of maybe identify it with older screen scraping technology, but it's certainly a lot more than that. It's a lot more integrated with intelligent automation, augmentation products. And another misconception that people tend to think about it as replacing jobs, and that's been written about quite a lot. But it's from what we've seen, it certainly isn't replacing entire jobs. It is automating tasks and entire activities, but it certainly hasn't got to the level yet, at least that we've seen, that it's replacing people. It's definitely much more of a deterministic augmentation tool. But it's capable of delivering a lot more than simply labour arbitrage and productivity.
I have to say I'm a bit disappointed that there's not going to be a shiny robot in the office next to myself. But Daniel, I wonder if you could tell me, how is this different from other types of automation, or rather, does it replace traditional types of automation like business process management?
So yeah, I guess the big sell around RPA is that it democratizes that automation task and skill into technically less able people within the organization. So instead of it being an IT skilled led product set, it's very much put it into the realms of operations with much less coding experience required. So in that respect, much more operational folks can use and build automations at a very basic level. I think, and also in terms of training, there's a incredible patter of training and a community around RPA now. You can learn, you can get upskilled, you can learn how to use different tools, you get certifications, and you can get very experienced very quickly. So there's a huge plus for RPA in that side.
Yeah, I think RPA is an extremely exciting technology. It really has the potential to transform businesses. But we hear a lot of horror stories from various customers and partners that we've worked with in the past. Projects not getting over the line, and at the same time, we're told that this technology can really speed up automation. So there's obviously a sort of contradiction there with a lot of these projects. So what is it behind it? Where are people struggling to get started with this?
Yeah, so it really is a tool. It's a great technology, but it is a tool, so it will be as good as the operator. Now, there's a number of reasons that we're seeing projects fail. A lot of them are actually environmental, which is probably subject for another part of this webinar. But a big part will be coming down to using and selecting the right process as well. Some people do tend to get a little bit ambitious or over-ambitious initially and pick a process that might be too complex or too much for the experience and the environment that exists in order to support it. The other challenge with RPA is it'll work with any system. It's non-invasive, but those systems themselves will have flaws. There's no such thing as a perfect system. So if there are flaws today that, and there often are, where a user interacting with the system might crash frequently, it might hang, things might happen with that system on a frequent basis, that users tend to become slightly ambivalent to and accepting of. And when you put RPA in, which is very deterministic and very rule-bound, suddenly it comes across one of those glitches and it will stop. And unless you take account of those in terms of how you design the robot, how you build the robot, and then how you support and deploy that robot, things will happen where the robot will stop working. So that's an inevitable part. So that's why it's good to work with someone who has experience in terms of how the systems work, but also how to deploy the RPA software in its most effective way as well.
One of the examples that we've been seeing quite a lot of, certainly feedback from various customers, is where they've maybe bitten off more than they can chew in terms of the process most suitable for starting their RPA journey. And by that I mean they picked the process where perhaps they felt the most pain. And then what happened is the process turned out to be a lot more complex than they expected. You mentioned exceptions there, Daniel. Lots and lots of exceptions, which means that the development time for that actual robot and getting it deployed turned out to be a lot longer than they expected. How would you look to sort of mitigate that from happening in the future?
Yes, so we've seen the same in our experience. So what we find practically is about 80% of the process ends up being exceptions. So you have a happy path, and that's where we normally start when we deploy any automation on a process. The happy path is the easy path, and that's only, say, up to 50% of what actually happens most of the time. The rest is truly the exceptions, where and they're typically business ones. Something or any stage of that process doesn't always fit a single point of decision. There'll be 2 or 3 options, 3 or 4 variables, and that's why a lot of automations don't succeed at first, because they follow a happy path, but then they only work for part of the time. And when they only work for part of the time, the users or the SMEs and the people in the operations who are working with that robot, they become a little bit despondent. When it doesn't work, when it constantly crashes, it loses credibility, and that's when the project typically is classed as a bit of a failure, because it doesn't work all the time. It doesn't generate the returns that were promised or expected. So there's no reason why it has to be that way. If you have a formal and definitive approach that you can deploy at the start and then through the whole process end to end, from design and discovery right the way through to deployment and support. And we have one. I hate to sound sort of consultancy, but we have something that we call the RPA operating framework, and that has 4 pillars, which is the process management, is delivery management, the environmental and operational management. And we use those 4 pillars to divide up basically our operating framework to how we deploy and scale RPA for any of our clients.
So it sounds like your RPA operating framework is really a key part of getting this right. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about it.
Absolutely. It's fundamental really to getting started, but also to the ongoing RPA framework or RPA program or journey or whatever you want to call it. It starts at the very beginning. So as I said, the process management is the key part. That's where it all really starts, and that's where the process all begins for RPA journey. Process management itself, it has your process discovery element in terms of finding which candidates might be suitable. You have an assessment framework within that to really weed out the complex from the simple, and understand where the returns and benefits are versus where the costs might be, in order to really get a sense of feasibility and suitability for automation. And then you've got your selection of those processes, and further then defining them, and by that I mean what is the as-is process today, getting a good detailed picture from the higher level right the way down to keystroke, and defining that properly in collaboration with the people who actually operate the process today. That's the most important thing. So you've got to make sure you capture it in a way that faithfully represents what happens, not only in the happy path, but in all those exceptions as well. And there are exceptions that we cover that users don't always think about. So for example, they might go onto a website to log in, and the system just might not be unavailable. It might be hanging or might not be responding. We have to tell and build and code the robot very specifically what to do in those instances. So there's a lot of exceptions that we capture that the users will be aware of, and some that they won't necessarily think of naturally. But that's what our whole process management methodology is about. And more recently, we've effectively, by selling automation, we I guess ultimately we're selling efficiency. We're selling an innovative product, and like every other firm and RPA firm, we started out doing documents to capture that process definition. They're effectively known as they're typically known at least as the PDD, the process definition document. They tend to be very traditionally word processor based, Excel based, that type of thing. So they're very offline, very separated from the actual reality of the process itself. And for us, every time we worked on these things as a client, they just took longer and longer to produce, and they were so detached from the people who were at the process. We wanted to find a way that was more connected, more real-time and much more collaborative, and that's really why we looked at the Score product, because we were looking at a few others of how could we possibly do this. And a chance meeting that we had, I saw the Score product, and I saw in it something that we could use to take our entire operating framework, but specifically the process management, and digitize that. And that's what we've spent the last 6 months really doing, and working with yourselves to hone that and refine the product and get it to do a few extra little things that maybe didn't before, and it's working for us really well and our clients.
Oh, that's great to hear. But what I'd really like to know is, concretely, what is it you actually do first, and then what happens?
So the easiest way to explain that is probably with an example. So when we first meet with a client, they usually fall into one or two brackets. They've either heard about RPA, someone's been to a conference or a webinar, and they think that sounds great. I know that we can use that somewhere, but they're not quite sure where. The other type of meeting that we have is someone who's done quite a lot of research. They've maybe looked at 4 or 5 different tools, and they've looked around the organization, talked to different departments, and they've got a clear idea, 5, 6 different processes that they think they can automate. And basically that's a great starting point. We tend to then temper expectations. You've got to start somewhere. It's usually a pilot or a POC, that type of a thing. But where we normally begin is going through those candidates. So if you have a list of candidates, we always used to use the old methods of sort of doing an assessment on those to see how complex they would be, how complex the systems that are involved are, trying to get a sense of what the benefits of return might be. But what we've started doing using Score is to plug those into the mapping tool, and using the RPA assessor. And what we're able to do, just with 2 or 3 boxes per process, is not only to do an assessment of the complexity of the process and the systems, and therefore how easy it would be to start automating the process, but also we capture quantitative data, such as the handling times and the frequency that those tasks and activities are run, We also capture the costs associated with the people who perform those roles today, so we can get a sense of what the benefit might be if they were no longer doing that particular activity. Not that they go anywhere, because we're talking about automating tasks mostly, but it gives you at least a value for what those might be worth. And we get those into into the score tool using those tools. And what that basically gives us then for each of those processes is a high-level business case in terms of the potential benefit and return, but it also then puts them into the pipeline list. So we, in the space of a couple of hours with a client, going through some of their process candidates or potential opportunities, we end up with 10 or 12 opportunities listed out in the pipeline in order of potential value that might provide. Yeah, so that's how we sort of rationalize those various candidates, and those candidates can come from a number of areas. Once you automate one or two, you normally get a bit of a deluge as you share that information. That word gets around the organization. Someone from HR, someone from finance, someone from procurement, someone from IT, they'll all get wind and they sort of say, right, well, actually we've got a few processes. What's suitable? Can it do this? Is usually the question you get, and it's the straightforward answer is RPA is deterministic. So we tend to start small and then scale is the key with this. We start with things that are rule-bound, mundane, repetitive type of tasks. So if there's a logic behind how a task is performed, how the outcome is reached, that's a good candidate. And if it's repetitive and it has high volume, even better because it has higher returns potentially with it. So that's how you would select processes, and then how you would actually pick which one to start on is usually a matter of, once you've gone through that amount of work and you've got a list of candidates that we might be able to automate, where to begin is normally sort of, I hate the word, but it's an RPA committee, and that's a terrible term to use, but for want of a better one, it's one that seems to stick. And it's getting someone from operations, someone from finance and accounting, or the operational departments are involved, someone definitely from IT who understands the systems involved and the infrastructure or environment, and basically looking at those processes and trying to weed out what might be the potential issues or complexities with automating those. And this is where we really do sort of use especially the IT folks, knowing what they do about the infrastructure, the systems, how they work. There are some restrictions with RPA in terms of what it can work well with, or how you need to actually build an automation that can be more complex than another. So it's good having that inside view of how the systems work. Once those folks have got together and you've weeded out the processes that are going to be a little more complex to solve, or can't be solved as it stands today, and maybe something else needs to happen first, or that maybe there's some other process optimization in the network, you end up with maybe a top three, and then it's just a case of picking one or two of those and getting started.
There's certainly an awful lot to think about before embarking on an RPA program of work, or even if you've only just started. What would you say were your top tips, Daniel?
I guess with any transformation program, always have a clear why, the purpose, the objective, basically. Be clear on why you want to do something. And that might be you want to save costs, you want to improve output and productivity, you want to improve customer service, you want to improve customer or employee morale. Whatever it is, have it clear and have alignment on that. That's probably the most important thing, because we've seen projects waver where someone, I'm not naming any names, but someone maybe in the finance organization is hoping to see some returns, but the operational goal was innovation and a marketing exercise to show customers and showcase that the innovation that the organization was pursuing. So those two don't necessarily correlate. So it's having a why and being very clear at the outset is probably the first thing. And in terms of moving forward, whether you have chosen an RPA platform or not, certainly these steps can help, but getting started is essential. And that sounds silly, maybe slightly simple, but RPA is simple, but it's not necessarily easy. So getting started, getting some numbers down, getting some processes mapped out with some basic numbers with those, to start to get a sense of what might be possible, what of the art of the possible is, and having people who understand the processes and people who understand the systems to contribute to that. It doesn't have to be a big exercise, but get started, start simple, have clear expectations. That would be it.
Well, thank you, Daniel, for those excellent insights there. I love that quote or phrase. The RPA is simple, but it's not easy. I think one of the things that I take away from this is certainly that although RPA is a disruptive technology, and as I said at the beginning, very exciting, you still have to live by the same kind of rules and approaches that you take for any sort of change or transformation, regardless of the technology. We've seen technology around automation improve huge amounts over the last decade, certainly. But actually, fundamentally underlying that is the same challenges and problems. You've still got people, you've still got processes you have to think about, you still have business objectives that have to be met, and you're still trying to reconcile all the different needs of different stakeholders. And certainly one of the things that we're seeing and hearing is that a lot of the same mistakes are being made with RPA as perhaps were made with business process management systems, going back 20 years ago, where the new technology was exciting and clearly improved and accelerated how work happened. But you still have to take the time to think about where you're going to apply it. I think your point about the why is absolutely number one for me too. If you're not clear on why you're doing it, where you're going to apply it, and take the time to think about the impact and what are you going to do about that, how are you going to mitigate those challenges, then it's going to be the same as any other. It's going to live and die in just exactly the same way. But I hope that anyone watching our webinar today certainly take away some of the insights that Daniel's provided us, and certainly have a much better chance of making it a success first time. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.